That this is what? Okay. Well, I was waiting for him to get this started up. Is it up? Okay. Good. There's nothing coming out here though. Oh. Okay. Okay. Check. 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 Now it's working. Check. 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 Okay. Okay. Cool. Come on in, Sergey. He's just like peeking in the door. All right, we're just going to jump in and start. And so the idea here is about kind of a historical context for economics. And go back to the beginning of this here. So actually, I'm going to try to zip through this really quickly and have this be a basis for discussion, and then switch into kind of discussion exploration mode of how does this change the way we talk and think about economics and wealth. So this was New Economy, New Wealth. This was one of the first prezzies I made back in 2009, and I did update the graphics on it since then, but this is old stuff. So jumping in really quickly, we're all familiar with these kind of economic ideologies, right? But the thing is that in their actual implementation, they're a lot more complicated, right? There's degrees of centralized control or decentralized control, mixed systems, how they're governed. Doesn't boil down quite as simply to those economic just to those ideologies. There's a lot of complexity in their implementation, and there's a lot of complexity in the thought of analyzing economics and what is relevant and how they work. And if you actually look at kind of the schools of thought in economics, there are a lot of schools of thought of how to analyze these things, and different theories and approaches for how things should be managed and executed. And then as we even start getting into more modern heterodox, institutions of this, things start getting really creative, and you start thinking, wow, look at this huge body of work. We must know a lot about economies and economics, right? Until you actually think about how poorly our economies really work, maybe we don't know as much as we think we do. So in fact, I'm suggesting maybe at this point, we've kind of forgotten something really important about a context shift that's happening. Like most of these things, some of them predate industrial age, but most of these things are industrial age economic models, and we're no longer in an industrial age. So what does that actually mean about the way that we need to be able to shift the context? Because most of the debates about economics are actually happening in a pretty narrow context that may even not be relevant at all anymore. So let's zoom out a little. Most of those things are kind of in a frame of land, labor, and capital as the relevant economic components, right? And even most of that is happening inside of the scientific paradigm, kind of scientific worldview on reality, right? But if we zoom out and look at kind of a larger historical evolutionary context, look at the economic evolution, and let's see what this might look like. So I would assert there was a time where we could describe something as even humankind as existing in natural economies, right? Where we don't have land, labor, and capital. We really just have land as the economic component here. We don't have organized labor as a resource. We don't have capital. And so that's it for the functional economic components. And the paradigm that we're operating in here is more of the kind of mythos magic frame, and not the scientific paradigm where we science cut ourselves off from everything and operate inside of this attempt at objectivity. And the social patterns that emerge from this, or that are congruent with this, hunter-gatherer types of tribes, but people operating as a part of nature, not separate from nature, following seasonal rhythms of food, or potentially migrating with prey and that kind of stuff, or not the prey. Yes, the prey. Sorry. Tribes and clans, also some of the social patterns there. But then we have this agricultural revolution, and I'm actually revising some of my thinking about this and reading David Graeber's latest book, but don't want to confuse the discourse too much by injecting all that. But maybe in the conversations afterwards, we can explore that stuff. We start having agricultural age economies, I think largely shaped by the arrival of writing, but monarchies, feudalism, empire. And in this scenario, the functional economic components are now land and labor. We actually have organized labor as one of the ingredients, which was not exactly organized labor before, but it isn't even just, we'll get to that in a second. And this is happening in a little bit more of a hierarchical and often religious paradigm. And the kind of structures that emerge from this, the technologies that emerge are like farming and husbandry. And then what we have as far as like why labor is actually now an ingredient here is we kind of have the domestication of everything, right? The domestication of people, land, animals, and this produces food surpluses and storage, which allow us to have increased concentrated populations, an emergence of specialization, and we have different classes also connected to writing, that can be ruling classes or governing classes or clerical classes. And we started having much stronger hierarchies and the social structures that come out of this, cities and nation states and empires and kingdoms, and right, like, does that all make sense? Cool. Then we have the Industrial Revolution, and we start getting into a more familiar territory. I put those ideologies, capitalism, communism, socialism there as kind of some of the flavors. We already talked about this, so I'm not going to talk about it again, but this is the familiar map that we kind of talk about economics from. And what are the technologies that emerge there? Are banking and industry, and what this era is characterized by is like a progress in science and manufacturing coupled with interest-based money, which causes this exponential growth of the economy, or drives exponential growth of the economy. And so we hence have this explosive growth of population and technology and resource consumption, right? All of that is emerging out of the industrial era, and the kind of social structures, governments, corporations, institutions, that type of stuff. But now we have the electronic revolution and enter into information age economies that I think we mostly don't know how to talk about, because we are in this awkward transition phase right now where we're into information age economies, but not all the way out of industrial age ones. Like, we haven't seen the end yet of the existing financial infrastructure, but I do think that is on the near-term horizon, right? That we have the unraveling of what we think of as economics right now, because that was actually all industrial age economics. So we're in this kind of awkward transition window. And now we actually have 4 functional components. We have land, labor, capital, and information. I didn't make up the term information age, so I want to make clear that information is not data. All of these are actually flavors or forms of process. When we say land, we don't necessarily actually just mean a defined plot of space. We actually mean the productive process that land is doing, right? Like, how is land actually producing resources and that kind of thing. Same thing with labor. We don't necessarily mean time clock things. Same with capital. Used with the money, but what the capital is for in the process. And each one of these introduces sort of a quantum leap in capacities. Information is another quantum leap. So think about it this way. If you could snap your fingers right now and disappear all the software in the world, would that be disruptive to the economy? Would that mess up a lot of businesses? What is software but words that a programmer has written down on something, right? It is just information, but it becomes embodied process. And so right now, the quantum leap of processing that is shaping things is actually information, even more than capital. But we still have, because we haven't exited industrial age economics, we still have a lot of influence from the old capital and economic structures. But I would assert that influence is waning, and we have an opportunity of a different kind of shape of space here. Does that make sense? Info not as data, but as process? Sweet. And then this is related to the conversation we had in the other one about scientific paradigm versus systems paradigm, but stepping into a systems paradigm here. And so what are the technologies that emerge from this? Peer-to-peer networks. And this is where I'm saying, this is what I'm suggesting the dynamic where we are in the process of seeing is that industrial age command control structures, they actually can't adapt quickly enough in an information age for how fast everything is moving. Those centralized structures, control structures, can't move quickly enough. So they get outpaced by adaptive organizations with better feedback loops and better embodied intelligence, where we push the intelligence to the edges. In other words, fiat currencies and hierarchical organizations like corporations and governments start to be replaced by efficient distributed currencies, scalable gift economies, self-organizing networks, that kind of thing. It may be hard to believe, except that we have certain sacred cows that, like, markets are the efficient means for distributing resources, but maybe markets are not so darn efficient. Like, maybe we need to question some of those sacred cows. Like, if they were so efficient, why don't we use them in our households? Because there's huge costs and barriers to different things, not to mention that it creates artificial bottlenecks of scarcity with money that can truly be an artificial bottleneck. Like, markets were a signaling system that was useful and efficient before we had information age signaling systems. So anyway, so we get decentralized organizations, self-regulating social organisms. Again, this was created in 2009 before we had terminology for DAOs and that kind of stuff. So let's look at the timescales we're talking about. Natural economies, depending on how you want to count human history, somewhere between millions and hundreds of thousands of years of the timelines that we were operating in natural economies. And then agricultural economies for approximately the last 5 to 10,000 years. Industrial age economies, really just the last 500 years. Notice the time compression and the acceleration here. So information economies will operate for how long? Maybe 50 years or something, if we think about this time compression. So in case you're wondering whether you're going to see this complete transition in your lifetime, I think the actual thing to be wondering is whether we are still going to be here for the next one after this, right? Because of how quickly everything is compressing. So this was called New Economies, New Wealth. I want to switch and talk a little bit about wealth. So that was kind of the economies frame. So remember all those economic models? Mostly what they've concerned themselves with are their focus is on scarce resources, managing scarcity. They relate to currency as just a medium of exchange or trade. Think of it as the way we often are tokenizing everything still, or still kind of stuck in that frame. And wealth as if it's just accumulation, not as if it's healthy patterns of flow. So let's consider those assumptions. Information age assets don't actually follow the same scarcity principles. In fact, there's an inverse relationship. They grow in value when shared. When you have shared protocols and shared patterns in the information world, it's more valuable. Like, think about the first fax machine or the first email account. How useful was one fax machine? You can't fax to anybody, right? How useful is, like, email becomes so powerful and useful because it spreads to everyone. So the value of information age processing actually increases as it grows, and we're still trying to manage tech companies as if it's proprietary, let's hold on to this, let's charge for this, instead of let's get this breakthrough in protocol to everyone, right? Unless you're in the open source context, right? But we basically still are struggling with this inversion that's happening. So if info age economies don't revolve around scarcity, then none of the old models really apply in the same ways. Now, also, we've been talking about currencies instead of just currency as money. So the thing is that every currency basically embodies multiple dimensions, has rules about these things. Can be a medium of exchange, can also be a store of value, unit of account, token of status, reputation, a measure or metric. But these are all configurable in their relationship in different ways. They're separable and configurable. So if you think, for example, of a college degree as a token of status that you earn by getting the right stacks of credits, you need 15 credits of this and 25 credits of that. Those are units of account for the time that you spent earning, learning about different things. But those units only count if you get a good enough grade, which are a performance metric, right? These are like 3 non-monetary currencies that everybody has learned to navigate in our educational system. And designed to work together. So money isn't the whole picture here. Now, how do you experience wealth? What I like about this is these are actual answers that people gave me when I asked these questions. And my favorite answer on there is Craigslist. But but again, this is outdated. This is, these questions were asked in 2009, so nobody said Bitcoin or anything. But the thing about wealth is, have you noticed that more money does not necessarily make you more happy? This is actual surveys, research done here, that you basically level off in your happiness once your basic needs are met, that more money doesn't actually result in more happiness. So the idea that the goal is accumulation is not congruent with what actual wealth is. In fact, I would say in the same way that cancer, which is very effective at accumulating resources, is not the same as health. So if these rules are changing, what might this all look like? And for those of you that came to the other session, this kind of how does this new wealth work? This is where we introduced for the first time really this living systems model of wealth that we talked about the other day. But these are dimensions that are all a part of all living systems. And I'm kind of just going to not talk about it much today. For those of you that missed that, you can always come and talk about it more. But parts and products, properties, performance, relationship between systems, and the evolutionary capacity, these are all simultaneous dimensions that are alive, that are a part of every living system. And there's different currencies that operate in those different levels. And the expanse and the influence of the level increases as we go out here. The evolutionary capacity actually gives you the ability to change the dynamics in all the other levels and such. And so that's another conversation maybe for another time about change models and strategies for systems change. But where our normal economy is, by the way, that little corner over there is speculative wealth, is actually disconnected from the living system. And that's part of the problem. And so if we continue to create currencies that are not wired, you guys just came from a session, nature-backed currencies and stuff. If we continue to have our currencies disconnected from the systems that sustain life, we can't have regenerative finance. And I think we can just stop there and switch to
You have a little bit of currency system.
Oh yeah, that's true. Okay, hold on. Sorry, I'm fighting the system here. So these are examples of some of the currencies that operate in those different domains. Money, derivatives, poker chips, crypto coins are things that are in speculative wealth realm. Tickets, gift certificates, commodities, gold coins, things that are in the tradable wealth, measurable wealth, ways of actually measuring things that we have. These are, gluten-free, amount of CO2, being depleted, different things like that. Rankable, things like Amazon ratings or listings, leaderboards, Olympic medals, those kinds of things. Nameable wealth, like we talked about this again the other day. Do you remember when food was just food, not bio, organic, grass-fed, free range, fair trade, all of those things? And I don't say that with skepticism. I say that those are actually trying to make visible wealth at the relational level that isn't obvious by a price tag. Since we can't boil that all down to one dimension. We actually need other signals and indicators. And then we get to the levels of possible wealth that actually shape the evolutionary capacity of systems. Is that good enough? Okay, cool. So, yeah.
When you spoke about the shift to information, beyond what we precisely mean by it, you said that it's better when it's shared, and it looks like you mean that it intrinsically leads to a more value flows system instead of a scarcity system as we are now. But I was thinking, because actually connecting to the post-capitalist thing, this is basically the basic claim of Paul Mason when he said that the information age is not compatible with capitalism, so capitalism will die. But actually, there is a professor that wrote a very extensive critiques of this, demonstrating that information capitalism can well happen and is happening, as well as, for example, human works better when they share and when they are solidar with each other. But it's not what is happening, and it's not intrinsical that we move toward a system in which this happens. At the same time, we should make it clear that, I mean, maybe it's better to say that in the information age, it's progressively more feasible to create an abundance-driven system more than a scarcity system, or that is more difficult to maintain a scarcity system. Because I don't think that in the next years it will be so easy to move into the direction that we are in abundance and no more in scarcity, because power structure are still very, and will use also the information age tools to maintain scarcity at their own advantage to accumulate, no?
Well, first I would say that the counterpart to scarcity is not abundance. It's actually flow. It's actually regenerative. In scarcity is really anchored in hoarding. Most of what we need is a part of regenerative resources. The place that we move toward ultimate scarcity is if we convert the whole planet to desert, right? And we are in the process of doing that right now through the scarcity-driven economy that drives the hoarding energy and the hodling energy, by the way, right? So I'm not suggesting that we have completed this transition. I'm suggesting we're still in this transitional space. We certainly still have information age capitalism, or where capitalism as an industrial age pattern is exerting a lot of its influence on information age patterns. But we also have emerging information age patterns that seem to be developing immune systems from that influence. And so we are in a transition period still.
I think it makes a lot of sense to see that when you have a big, large-scale system in place that's operating in one form, it's going to force the emerging system to be in those terms, because it can't operate. So we literally, intellectual property is required, because you actually have to force it into scarcity model so it can be owned. And so you have to create a new thing. So it will live there for a while, but it inherently can't stay there for very long.
I think I'm sort of circling around the same set of points, but looking at this as respectfully sort of as an artifact of a particular moment when you know, maybe hopeful moments of hoping for a transition to a kind of post-material economy. Looking at it now, do you feel like we're anywhere closer? I mean, if I look at the current situation with, you know, war in Europe and my gas bills having risen, 50% in the last few months, substitution of sunflower oil leading to palm oil, leading to deforestation in Indonesia, or the London Metals Exchange having to cancel trading because of because of an attempt to corner the nickel market. I mean, material economies are absolutely driving kind of, and scarce material economies, absolutely driving history at this moment. I mean, there's no kind of, I can't really see the emergent sort of post-material economy actually having anywhere near the same impact. So are we really moving in that direction?
So I also want you to respond, but one of the things that I want to say is that when we wrote this, when we did this the first time around, the number of people who could even hear this and care about it and even think that it was reasonable was like at least an order or 2 orders of magnitude smaller. So I think you're totally right that the crisis is here and huge, but from the point of view of receptivity of the conversation, and if you even just think like a lot of this is like you guys are saying, what, this is kind of obvious. That's my hope, right? And this was not kind of obvious 9 years ago, and that's a big, big difference.
13 years ago is when this Prezi was made. No, I don't think it's aspirational at all. First of all, we're not saying it's an immaterial economy. We're not saying matter goes away. We're saying our capacities for coordination, the capacities that information age technology bring for coordination are just obviously orders of magnitude more efficient than market signaling. Like, I'm not saying we have even mastered those capacities. In fact, I would say I observe that for the most part, we are still stuck. Like, is actually how much of the crypto space, which is trying to tap into these information age coordinative capacities, is still all stuck in flatland, tokenization flatland, right? It's still all stuck in managing market caps and, like, as if that is the game. And that's all distraction as far as I'm concerned. And I'm not saying this in a hopeful manner. I'm saying this as in, and you don't have to believe me either, but I'm saying this as in, like, it is as obvious that something that is, quadrillions of times more efficient than something else, even though it's still emergent, that it will overtake the thing that it is that much more efficient than. Exactly on what time scale and what bumps along the road and what battles there are in bumping out something that's entrenched, I can't say, but there's certainly going to be wars and shortages and those kinds of things still, because we're still in the influence of the industrial age, but we're being overtaken by something that is just so many orders of magnitude more efficient that what will the shape of the new thing be, I think, is actually important to identify. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, 3 quick points. First, to your point, if we look at back of the formation of nation and the practical implementations of a nation, you can see a historical period where it's mostly discourse, and then the discourse grows around it, and then implementations follow after. And I think that's not just in nations, but if you see larger social paradigms that need practical implementation, usually the pattern is that there's a growing discourse, which then kind of drops into implementations, often failing ones, and that pattern could be replicated here, and why there's maybe an orders of magnitude more people. This is a sign of growing discourse. At one point, the tokens, I think actually looking at tokens in this conversation is interesting how they form this sort of almost like a two-headed beast, that there is a part of that head is actually which is aping or imitating industrial economy in terms of creating an economizable object that is like a way of holding value, like creating the wall of value. On the other hand, we can look at the other head of it, that it can be a unit of flow. Potentially, it's something that can be an instrument for circuitry, etc. And I think both things are play at tokens. Mostly the greed is still in the industrial side. Final point, the Greek concept of oikonomos, the father of economy, was actually a concept of abundance. And there are some good articles on this, that one of the key differences that the core paradigm of economics was abundance, and abundance not just as utopian positive, but actually a problem, because abundance, when you have too much of everything, leads to a situation of efficiency. And how they formed the analytics of economics was actually, how do you deal with overabundance and what kind of efficiency it builds? There would be a lot more there. For example, why the structure was that economy should not be operated for the sake of economy, because this led to a position of a slave to an economy itself, which is an interesting social commentary from thousands of years back. But maybe I'll leave that for later.
Hello. So I mean, I think there's a lot that I really resonate with in what you guys are talking about. Sorry, I have so much. I don't know where to start. But I think when you're saying capital and the systems paradigm, or the functional economic components, it seems to me you're talking maybe more about commodities rather than capital, at least in the way that I understand capital, as being like a type of social relationship rather than sort of like an economic component in the way that I think it's being described here. Because we're saying like the industrial economy is, yeah, the introduction of capital. I would say it's the introduction of probably commodities. And then capital is sort of like maybe more the social relationship behind those commodities. But I resonate with this idea that information is becoming a new sort of economic component that's like increasing, or like the sort of being a sort of thing that like it's being overlaid. We're adding like much more complexity on top of these already systems that existed before, in which the next one always had like properties of the previous one, and there was sort of like continuation. That was like totally within I think Marxist theory. I would really be interested if you guys have read Mackenzie Wark's book, or her writing called "Capital is Dead," but she is saying very similar things from like a Marxist, so I mean really a post-Marxist point of view, but that's her theory is that capitalism is dying and is being replaced by something worse that she calls vectorialism, where rather than taking the same type of classes, rather than like the proletariats and the bourgeoisie, we have now hackers and vectorialists, where information is sort of like the new sort of like commodity, or like the new like super important economic component. And vectorialists are basically the ones who are able to control the flow of information, and hackers are the ones who manipulate information and create new information to then be used for something else. And so like a vectorialist would be like, for example, one of these big tech companies or something like that. They control information, and like it's becoming a more and more important part of the economy and how it works. And I totally resonate with that.
Because I hear why you would say that that's what we're saying, that capital is commodities, but we're not. It's really clear that for us, each one of these factors is a verb. It's not a noun. It's a process, not a thing. Right. And so when we look at it, we look at it that way because it is the means of production is closer to what it should be. It's the actual process. It's a new class of process that becomes available that creates a whole new set of patterns as a result of that new process being available. And so I can see why she would put it in that way, where you think of the data and the control of the data and the commodity and the control of the commodity. But I think what we're talking about is, no, don't look at it that way. Look at it as the new verb that's available. So we aren't looking at it that way, although I do see that as a different frame.
Very much that. The thing that I would want to say about especially information age economies, why the game changes. Like you could look at Facebook or Google or something right now saying, those are the power players, but how does Facebook get its data? Where does it come from? It's all produced by us, and if you have a proper Web3 framework that can run a peer-to-peer Facebook on those scales, which so far all that garbage marketed as Web3 can't do, but we're suggesting Holochain can. But you just don't give them your data, they don't have it. We're the producers, we are the means of production, right? And so when you start seeing the different power dynamics in information as process, not information as commodity, and capital as the process, because capital embodies a whole set of relationships of ownership of, right, the means of production in terms of the, so it's not, we're not suggesting it's commodities at all. I mean, it really is about the quantum leap in the means of production, which is in some ways radically more democratizable in an information age than it even was before that.
From the okay, I think maybe part of the issue, because if you say, because yeah, you did say earlier that when you say land, you don't mean like the plot of land, but what you do with the land, and maybe because it is a noun, and sure, and like, but when I think of capital, I think of a process, or I think of a relationship. I think I want to skip my pedantic points maybe, but so what you're saying with that we are like the means of production, I think what you're getting at that can fit in maybe Mackenzie Works' framework is that like you are seeing sort of where the trend is going and where the dangers are in terms of like where information is going and how information can flow. And I think like part of, like in my opinion, like the crypto economy is like the ultimate like vectoralist economy, because it is purely information and it's purely you know, whether or not there's something backed by it, you gotta do something to make it backed by commodity and land, which we have to discuss with ReFi things. But yeah, I think that's like, if you think of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, you also had similar like mutualistic type of exchange relationships that were not necessarily at the very least did not look like the same as what, you know, peak industrial capitalism like exchange relationships looked like either, right? It was like the proto-capitalism that started off in, you know, under feudalism, like building these bubbles of new modes of production that then over time grew thanks to like advances in technology was a big one, but also like people using that technology, and like after so long, like tradesmen being like killed over and over by like larger feudal lords who like didn't want them to exist because they wanted to retain their power, but then eventually them being able to survive and ultimately becoming stronger than the nobility. And now we have like our capitalist classes, like, you know, it's just like this feedback loop that started really, really small, that was like kind of nice, and now it's like, oh my God. And so like I think potentially what we're looking at here is like a reaction as well, like to, of course, like capitalism and what it was, and with the, you know, the electronic revolution or digital revolution, we call it, we are able to make new modes of production, but within a particular layer. And I think, you know, I think the hope in some extent is that if we can do it well enough in this layer, we can sort of like bring it back down into the other layers where how we handle land, labor, and capital is more democratic in the way that we have been able to like figure out how to like more equitably handle the information age stuff.
Can I ask you a question? So do you see vectorialists as actors that span those four circles, or do you see it simply as like something that's operating within the information flow?
She defines it. I mean, she's specifically talking about information and like just that information becoming more and more important within the economy and their control of that. And through the control of information, they can also control these other things. So for her, it's like way more scary the importance of information because of that and because of their control of it, like you cannot, there's like very little that you can come up with to sort of like get out of it in the same way that Marx was like, okay, there is this opposing forces between labor and capital, but if labor collectivizes itself and forms unions and like fights for, then you can like overcome capital. I think there's a bit of a struggle on how do you do that in an information economy.
We have to talk. So this is exactly why we've developed holochain the way we have. Because the thing that you need to have, the equivalent of the unionization, is you need to have an uncapturable carrier. The information has to live inside an uncapturable carrier. Yeah. So that's why the medium really, 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 really matters. It's got to be that way, because otherwise it will be captured and you will get factorialism. But so that's why what the process looks like makes a difference. You can have a Borg-like process that comes on and it'll be really nasty for us all. But the form of the process of information, it can take a couple different paths. This is why it matters. No.
No, distributed ledger alone doesn't do it. Most of them are already captured. They have points of centralization that they don't acknowledge. In fact, consensus itself is not only a point of centralization because everybody must have the same state, but is a point of centralization configured by every one of the consensus algorithms in a positive feedback loop. Like you described the evolution of the early tradesmen to the massive corporations we have right now, I would say that's because we have a positive feedback loop, right? Where corporations use the acquisition of their resources to what's that? Yeah. Exactly. Through capital, we have this positive feedback loop where corporations use the acquisition of resources to increase their acquisition of resources, which is also a cancer pattern. But this is a positive feedback loop. What people are not acknowledging, seeing, or admitting or something is that at the heart of every blockchain is a positive feedback loop that centralizes power. Proof of work and proof of stake are consensus algorithms, and all that you do, if you do proof of work, you can buy, if you can buy more computing power, then you get more money, which lets you buy more computing power, which gets you more money, which, right, it is a positive feedback loop that centralizes power and control of the blockchain. And we're calling that a consensus mechanism for a decentralized architecture. It is not. It is decentralizing washing. Yeah, exactly. And so those are fundamentally already captured carriers. Decentralized ledger alone does not get you there. Decentralized alone doesn't get you there. I mean, sorry, whole set of other conversations there.
Yeah, actually, that's part of one of the topics that we're going to be giving a talk on, and for which I would love if you guys is on informational collapse as a central point of failure. So through a centralized system to a decentralized system, and why a distributed system is actually necessary in order for these systems to be uncapturable. Because ultimately, and this is a lot of the discourse at the Economic Space Agency, is that all of these protocols, all of these different cryptos ultimately operate as totally different economic protocols, economic spaces. And what we see, because there's a global ledger, you can build like some kind of application or something on a decentralized global ledger, but you still have to pay gas fees. And gas fees are subsumed to a price. And so as time goes on, even if you don't want to use the blockchain for an extractive purpose, the network will be subsumed into that kind of logic where we increasingly only see the price from the economic space of fiat, of all of these industrial economies, which is an economic space within which we're still living. We are right now between both of those economic spaces. And we are on a tipping point. I mean, there's in every different mode of production, and with the increase of or development of productive forces in different directions, new modes of cooperation are possible. So unions, it represents a very like industrial economics form of attempting to transcend relations. It's a form of cooperation based on previous modes of production at previous modes of I'm not saying unions are bad. I'm actually used to be a union president. But yeah, point is like distributed architectures will allow for like totally new modes of cooperation, such that the mode through which we even transcend existing industrial economics will be different, because the modes of cooperation to do so will be different.
I think most people agree on that here. But what I wanted to add as well is maybe that I resonate with like we're trying to build like a new system within the shell of the old. So we're always going to have like the remnants of previous modes of production, and this is extremely, in my opinion, obvious in the cryptocurrency space. And it's already, I mean, this is just a continuation of like intellectual property. So like Mackenzie work talks about intellectual property as being like one of the main vectors of control that are used. But I mean, you see this with NFTs very clearly, with the way that critics try to criticize NFTs, and the way that really, really dumb collectors of NFTs try to talk about NFTs. Like they talk about NFTs, they want to think of NFTs as like a material commodity that they own just in a digital space. But you're right, like you cannot to impose like mental models of commodity of capital onto what is a purely informational like medium, which you cannot do. And there's like horrible contradictions with that. And then I think just as a way to relate that, like we see that under capitalism now, like we still have remnants of feudalism, especially through landlords. I mean, we call it a landlord, because like it comes from this feudal relationship that we had a long time ago. Even though at the same time, land is treated as capital. Like it is private property that you have a very similar relationship with. And that, is probably part of the reason why we are extracting so much from the earth, of course.
NFT space, which is like a beautiful way of just saying like the mentality that we've inherited and applied to the space is very much primitive land grab, colonial. Yeah. Without any concern for reality and like the fact that there's this balance between an abundance and limited resources.
Totally. I'd love to inject one thing, because I keep hearing this frame as if this is an aspirational thing, or like when we were talking about the living systems wealth, as if this is something we want to move toward, or the paradigm shift. And I want to point out that's kind of an emotional frame, but it's actually not the nature of reality. It's like when we had the Copernican shift to thinking of the sun at the middle versus the earth at the middle, we didn't need to work to rearrange the solar system, right? What we did was we had another way of understanding the relationships in the solar system. What we're suggesting is that there are actually better ways of understanding the relationships. These are not aspirational, we want to move toward. These are actual facts and dynamics that are in progress, even right now, as how the industrial age asserts its influence. And so like even the things about like we're building something that's in the shell of this other like larger influential thing. I just want to point out that capitalism and all of our modern economies are a very small parasite on top of a much larger social economy. And that social economy is a small parasite on top of a much larger natural economy. we are not just inside capitalism. We are inside larger economies that follow different rules than capitalism. Let me just clarify, in case that's like not clear. Who paid for all the employees of any corporation to be potty trained, to learn not to shit themselves, right? That didn't get paid for in the commercial economy anywhere. Who taught them language? How functional would an employee be without language or potty training? That's all riding on top of a social economy that is happening for free. That's a gift economy. That's in a purely relational space. That social economy is riding on top of a natural economy. Nobody is compensating the sun, solar credits, solar tokens for the energy that we're getting, right? So we're not describing something that's aspirational. We're actually saying there are living, viable other patterns that are not the extractive capitalist, frame. And we actually have all of them to draw from. And so I just want to shift that, because it's not like we're in a position of no power. We actually are tapping into powers that are real and more powerful than the existing economy.
Seeds, if I had 3 seeds earlier, now I have 2, which are kind of something that might grow or not in this discourse, but and its continuations. First one, in terms of let's say the shadow of the land inside the economy, it is actually a very important analysis, and there is an analytic pathway that doesn't really exist, which is that, okay, the best way to describe it, if I go back to oikonomos, which is normally known as household, as a concept of a household, but this is a little misleading, because if you actually look at how they use the concept, it is more akin to a sense of an estate, but it's actually more abstracted than our concept of estate being. So way to put it in practice is you have this abundance, which is a problem, which is we also will find it a problem, by the way, potential and a problem at the same time. You have too much. The estate is your system that you're managing that performs efficiency for you to deal with and extract and gain from this overabundance. And this is an interesting pathway towards looking at something that behaves like a land but turns into an estate and turns into a system. And I think in that pathway there might be interesting crossover points with between concepts of estate, system, etc. That's one seed. The second one, I think there is problematics in the information age. I think you were kind of alluding to that you inherited that term. And I don't know which concepts we could use here, but just one practical point on this. I think much of what is talked about as this sort of almost like a war of information, just also to your points and the kind of McKinsey work, the vectorialists, is actually for me more reflecting a war of governance, because it's much, it contains this element of not just who holds the information, but rather who can define this information, as valid, as a source, and source to what extent, which is actually more a war of governance than actual information per se. And I think that element is highly important to bring into this conversation, not just to talk about the information itself, but it's actually moved from information management to a general management of our understanding and conception. And I think that's a much more focused way of thinking about that conflict, which is present in the second one.
Who controls the flows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for any other voices that want to participate or contribute that haven't. Who's being shy? Yeah.
So something you said a few minutes ago, which really captured my attention, is the idea that the current blockchains that are utilized for regenerative finance still work at the same patterns of capital accumulation. So what are we doing building on them?
I would ask that question.
Okay, so I guess that's a really, isn't that quite a structural conversation to have about regenerative finance as we're, yeah.
I think so. I don't think you can create regenerative finance in an extractive blockchain that's run by a centralizing consensus paradigm. I just don't think you can.
Distributed ledger tech opened the viewpoint because it's hidden that it's centralized. People actually believe that it is other than it is.
Yeah.
So that's an important point. Like there's a lot of the capacity to actually be in this conversation comes from what's happened there. So that's a value.
I guess what I'm yearning for is like I sense that you guys have the sort of the next step. You want to explore that, and we haven't got there because we've kind of got diluted lots of different smaller points.
Well, I'm going to talk about soft DAOs later today, which is that's more philosophical, but it's interesting to me about what you put in the center, and how we think about building DAOs in that kind of context. I will be doing some demos of just some of the apps that are currently available, just so people can get a sense of what that feels like, and we can do it on your own computers. You can launch it up, and we can play. And anybody who wants to have conversations about the structure of this stuff, we can do that. We could talk about sovereign accountable commons. We could talk about our thoughts about how to actually get back to the question of dealing land inside information process. We have this pattern that we're thinking about called land weaving society. So there's a lot of places it goes when you start from this place. So we can do a lot of that stuff.
Just one quick thread to respond to Pecco, and I'm aware of my hunger, so maybe you're hungry. I heard lunch was ready. I don't know if that's been said. Public service announcement. But just Pecco, I think kind of what you were getting at, I'm just interested to hear more, I guess, and from other folks. Like it reminds me of my partner's aunt makes jam, Ammy's Jemmy. And it's like, you know, you have loads of raspberries. Well, what the hell do you do with all these raspberries? You either give it away. So we talk a lot about like, okay, we're based in the scarcity paradigm. So what about the surplus paradigm? And it makes me think of some First Nations friends who introduced me to a book, and it talks about bioregional surplus as a peacekeeping mechanism. So I thought this is a very interesting pattern to look at. Okay, we have surplus of bananas over here. Who wants bananas? You know, and then just like how can we represent these with our current Cs or in the way that we are designing these systems. And it does make sense when it is a bioregion rather than some artificially drawn lines. So I would like to explore what this like surplus design space could look like in various contexts.
Let's have lunch.
All right, let's eat.
You want to say more? I'll say and listen. I want to hear you.
What she was saying, I think is super related to the idea of surplus value, and that in like the Marxist sort of theory of history is that agriculture was, of course, this revolution in which power was able to be accumulated because of the ability to sort of because there was surplus value, or like surplus of food that was able to be grown, and because of the like ability of particular actors were able to have control of that surplus, they were then able to like create these or solidify these class relationships to where people were dependent on them. So I think the question, or to me, it's not about necessarily creating surplus or creating abundance, but it is the governance and the relationships about how you handle that abundance or that surplus.
And what I was hearing was the way in which if that gets turned into gift, if sources of abundance are always turned into gift, that's a different way of doing it than if it's turned into commodity for sale on a market.
So I guess the question is, how do you prevent, how do you like enforce that relationship rather than, because I mean, I imagine probably, you know, speculation, what happened in history is that there were a lot of peoples who had this type of maybe gift economy and like relationships of allowing everybody to, you know, take part in the abundance, but, you know, something happened. Either another tribe came and dominated them, or there was a famine and it required a type of like centralization of power, and those like relationships became solidified over time and sort of compounded itself through history and then evolved into what we see today. Yeah, yeah.
What is the grammar of our?
So, but I think maybe. Sorry, go ahead.
To me, it's like, how rich is our grammar of how you solidify these relations? Because if there's a grammatics, the metagrammatics that's being held about what those possibilities are, then you can see it and solidify into one of them because you have the grammar rather than one that's not there.
Right. But I think it's grammar and the way you guys are talking about. I think in terms of like potentially developing new language, but also I think the particular difference with the information economy, or like using information as a medium through digital technologies, is the how quickly it is enforced and how quickly it can be put into like practical use through that medium, whereas these processes are significantly slower, of course, in the meat space. How do we the relationship that, you know, a capitalist social relationship took hundreds of years to instill. So like what is very dangerous maybe about like this switch to the information age is that if it's not if these types of relationships aren't thought of before and implemented into a medium in a way that is like universally accepted, then you can recreate, or then, but I guess the what you guys are saying is that you're trying to predict that is happening, and then also create those through code, kind of like those type of relationships that are more communal, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to say we actually don't know all the right relationships. We don't know all the right patterns, but we know that whatever they are, they have to be immune to capture by central control. So we actually have to build a medium that is immune to capture, that they can be encoded in. And so far, we don't see something other than Holochain that's actually fully decentralized with no point of centralized capture. And
the one other thing I would say is that, so there's capturability, and the second is the requirement for grammatics. And so we don't know what the thing is that it will look like, but we wonder if we can find the dimensionality and create a space that holds the dimensionality so you can express into being something along those in the dimensions. So the dimensions are things like, how do you deal with violence? How do you deal with governance? How do you deal with these things? And if we start to create a vocabulary and have the parts of speech of the embodiment of these things, then you can actually have the evolvability, because you've got a grammatic capacity in which to express the things that can evolve.
What I think of when it comes to like relevance to the information age are sort of like maybe appropriate data standards as like a big part, as a part of that, like in standards. Yeah, as at like the protocol level, like being able to express that in the protocol. I mean, of course, it's related to being able to express that in language.
Sorry. No, that was I was intending for that to be a really short answer. But so far, everything we've done in the computing space around protocols actually becomes ossified. You create a protocol and it inherently can't evolve, meaning SMTP, Simple Message Transfer Protocol, right, was a temporary protocol put in place by the team that was working to develop the ultimate email protocol. And they said, well, let's just put something in place as a short-term, flexible thing. But once it got in place, it was very hard to displace by something that we're still using it as the protocol, you know. And so that's the way protocols have been implemented. And yes, I think you're barking up the right tree with protocol. And again, even the etymology of it is the first glue, proto. Kolos, it's a glue thing. It was actually the first page that in binding a book that like glues the stuff together. So it does create coherence, and the need for grammatics is to have shared grammatics to create coherence. So we actually can understand encoding of signaling to each other. But we also, from an information age perspective, we need pluggable, playable, nestable, evolvable, self-describing protocols. So everything that we think of as a protocol from the past is actually not exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about another frame for it.
I think the addition of information as that extra circle is in itself, it's so dangerous because it can exist like in numerous forms, and you can't really put it down. It's like putting a road up, like it's just out there, and there's an abundance of it, and there's so much noise. Whereas, you know, the other three components like take a bit of time to put out. Is that what you were saying? Like it takes a bit of time to produce the land, capital, labor, and it takes a bit of time to like nurture it. Whereas information doesn't need nurturing; it's just out there. And I guess, like what you said, like you've got all these systems that have been put up, and we've had to kind of figure out over time how to iterate and make them safe. And we've made a lot of mistakes and hurt a lot of people in the process to figure out those security concerns.
Yeah.
So the temporal cycle of information, right? If we talk about the cycle of renewal, the cycle of renewal for information is effectively the speed of cognition, right? It's you create it into being in this sort of real time, automatic, like no wait. Like I can think about something and dream it up instantaneously to create it. All right, and then we've got to go out and do stuff in physical reality. But in information, it's out there and gone. To this point about grammatics, I think about grammatics as the ability to perceive and then to describe what I'm perceiving. I don't know if that comes close, but
I think you need to think about definitions before grammatics. No, if you're thinking about, I mean, what are the actual words referring to? So let's say we were talking about surplus. I mean, a surplus can mean a number of different things. You can talk about surplus value. Right. Can a grammar predate semantics? I'm trying to understand. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, on that point, like,
Yeah.
I think how you say, okay, how you're utilizing definition there, I think that actually kind of underlies something that might not be exactly what you're going with, that these are verbs rather than nouns, but I think it can be used as at least a description of something relative. If you actually have a unit that defines what it does, it doesn't have to define what it is. And this is precisely, if you're building a system with the paradigm that is simply about what it does, what it is becomes potentially superfluous. It might be useful, but it's not integral and therefore not ontological, which is why you can create systems that don't need definition before its operation. That's precisely that. And this also relates to grammars. That's a whole other kettle of fish. Let's not open that, because two perspectives on this, on this whole conversation beyond this point. When we talk about information, I would point out one point where we are already, where we're dealing with abundance, and abundance precisely in these forms where Greeks saw it both a potential and a problem. And that is the abundance of information data surrounding us from the internet, like if we want to process us, compounded with the loss of broadcast media leading to the so-called post-truth, which is just a distribution problem, and that is a problem of governance. It's like who governs where the information comes from and how that information is taken, which puts us in a position of abundance of definition in a way, like to use that, like what something means and what should be something, how something should be operated is ultimately in this question of abundance where we need systems of governance or simply systems to deal with that. So we are already facing information as an abundance problem. And this is the kind of area that we need solutions, and towards that, it's precisely creating systems that are not necessarily governance as we traditionally understand it, but operate something that's systemized and therefore create governance-like functioning that becomes important in this kind of situation.
One thing I want to just say about the information age, I would rather we called it the process age, and then the thing would be called process, because process is the thing. It's like the fact that process itself becomes what we can hold and manage and develop. I think it's a much closer way of talking about what we're meaning. Because it does. You know, you create a process and you create these processes, you can encode them in automation, and then that's the main factor of production is process. I want lunch. I don't know about other people, but yeah. Arthur, you want to have last word?
Well, I just wanted to say something about the signal to noise problem, the signal, noise filtering issue in an abundance of information age, and that it is extremely hard currently to do that because we are missing in the shape of our information and digital information, we're missing some fundamental things to the shape of it that don't allow us to be able to manage its integrity. We're missing, it doesn't have intrinsic integrity. We don't know where it came from. It's not like signed from any original source. It can be completely manufactured by Russian disinformation campaigns or whatever, right? And you can't tell if it's altered. It's like there's all this WikiLeaks stuff where they're posting documents, but how do you know they didn't just insert a not in a sentence or delete a not from a sentence, that completely reverses the meaning of something? There's no intrinsic integrity that keeps it unaltered. And anyway, there's some things like that as we put those fundamental capacities in play, which, big surprise, Holochain automatically manages. But where I think we have very different means by which to be solving the fake news and disinformation type things that we currently don't even have. The information doesn't contain enough of its own integrity for us to even do this kind of weeding, sorting.
Isn't it about the governance of information, and is that how the framework apply that to Holochain? Yeah. Yeah. But isn't that a governance issue of that issue? Like we're not allocating the human resources to.
I think it's governance within a wider sense. At least it's organization. Like it's ultimately an organizational question. How do we know that they didn't remove the not? There is some system organized that allows us to build trust on the island of that system, and that's ultimately organizational question, which I think underlies many of these more superficial questions like information that we are ending to. But that sense of organization is way wider than our current conception of organization, but it's still kind of from that root. Yes, let's visit that. Yeah.
And what will announce in the other room that this is happening now? Is that good? Where's the circle? There's something up in okay.
I say this. We should say that there should be something in parallel because there are too many activities. Okay. Hello, hello. Just a communication to organize ourselves. Given that there are many activities, today, we should do something in parallel. Otherwise, there is the risk of not every activity being done because at the end people are too tired, so somebody gets without his workshop. So I know the people that today have an activity are put your hands up. Okay.
Well, there should be more.
That already.
What other sessions do we have today? And shouldn't we do some in parallel? Because we're running out of time.
It goes away. Okay. How many are there on the table? Okay, and that's it.
There are 7 more sessions for today out there. 7.
Okay, we reward who is active in signaling. So okay, let's start and then yeah, cool.
Livestream is on.
Well, hello, hello. Hello, my name's Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy.
I'm going to talk about liberating structures. Liberating structures are awesome, cool things that are interaction patterns. They are a toolkit, a collection of 33 different action patterns, and they relate to each other. And that hopefully makes it nice and much easier to learn how to use these interaction patterns. Who was here on Saturday? All right, so many of you have experience with lots of these interaction patterns, the most basic of which are built around 3 design principles, and that is how participation is distributed, with the assumption that it should be distributed everywhere, how groups are formed with some expectation that groups should be small because that's helpful, and the third design third design element is a set of steps over time. So, and that's what makes liberating structures particularly interesting, because they are sort of algorithmic. They follow this process, they define it. So the pattern that everybody, I hope to God, is definitely familiar with and remembers till the day they die, that we used a lot on Saturday, was this basic liberating structure of 1, 2, 4, all. So this defines participation to some prompt or invitation, some question as we describe it. First with silent reflection, then with a one-on-one dyadic interaction, a brief conversation about that prompt, then a conversation in a group of 4, and then upregulating some piece of information to the larger context, the entire group, all. So this pattern and these types of pattern are really interaction patterns. They design how the interaction is sort of structured. We used this pattern 1, 2, 4, all a whole bunch of times over and over and over again, and we basically threw different types of prompts, different types of questions at the center of that. And the 4th design principle of liberating structures, the design element, is invitation. So in this central area of different interaction patterns, there are different types of invitations, different basic prompts that represent patterns of thinking that you might want to put inside of these interaction procedures. So an example of that would be, let's start with one we haven't done quite yet, which is an invitation that's called what, so what, now what. Exactly like it sounds, it asks us to split up and divide our thinking from observable data. What were the facts? What are the evidence? What is the observable behavior that we can see? And then get to our meaning making, our inference upon that data. What does it mean? What is the impact of that observation? And then move on to action coming at the end. All right, so now what? Now that I know what I've seen, I know what it means, what do I want to do on the basis of that information? So this is an invitation that we can dump, like I said, into one of these different interaction patterns. And there are basically, now let's move on, then we'll come back. So the next design element is around materials and space. So some liberating structures make use of some form of artifact. It either creates an artifact of thinking or it interacts with an artifact of thinking. So right now we are inside this sort of unconference open space technology, which enables us to together make an artifact that helps us organize time and shared attention. You can think about these exterior structures as providing contexts within which we might put these interaction patterns filled up with these different invitations. And while this is only half of the liberating structures toolkit, this provides a basic blueprint. First, learn these interaction patterns, then figure out good invitations to fill in these action patterns, and then look for bigger containery type patterns that provide a larger context within which to dump all of this stuff in, that help organize thinking and structure it thusly. So that's the high level overview. What's next? liberatingstructures.com. There's a book, The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures, written by Keith McCandless and Henry Lipmanowitz. All of the information is available on liberatingstructures.com. Go to the Slack channel.
So the other thing is why? Why does this matter? And I want to offer one reason why I think it matters. I've been hearing a lot of people talk about governance, and governance is often about decision making. Come on, y'all. Can you come into the circle? Yeah. If you would be so kind. If governance is one of the things we care about, this is a big chunk of governance, which is the structures in which you come into alignment. And so if we're doing these kinds of patterns in anything that we're trying to do with the commons or ReFi, being able to have a pattern for thinking about these kinds of things is like an order of magnitude up on your ability to do governance.
Which comes into the thing that I didn't say, which is these are tools for shared thinking. This is how we distribute cognition and no longer have to do all of this holding of complexity that is really, really fucking hard for an individual agent to do in a world that is as big and complex and as fast moving as reality. So this allows us to network our brains together so that we can create a little hive mind to distribute cognition that might have the opportunity to scale to the complexity that we're confronted with. Anybody else?
How do I know when to use which of these things?
Practice. Practice. What's really nice about all of these tools is that liberating structures are embodied practice, meaning that these are not propositions, these are not ideas, but these are patterns that you actually inhabit and you go through together. So I'm not offering a theory here that you have to then go apply. I'm literally saying, no, here is an example of procedural knowledge that will actually enable you to inhabit propositions, most of which are emblematic of ecological thinking with a strong skew of applied complexity science built into them. So if you like those ideas, if you like all of this blockchainy, decentralized, let's go do stuff ideas, and you wonder, but how do I proceduralize that? How do I actually do that stuff in physical reality? Then these offer you very simple step-by-step processes that you can use to inhabit those ideas that will enable a different type of knowledge sharing, which is perspectival, which is this is what I see, this is what you see, and then to put those things into relationship with one another. So it nests in this participatory knowing that we're doing together. So we're really trying to just jam pack as many different types of ways of knowing together so that the quality of networking brains is that you can articulate an aspect that is not at all within my map of reality. You are able to see, sense, perceive, and describe a facet of reality that I'm absolutely blind to, as a matter of fact. Or you might be able to articulate something that's just on the tip of my tongue. I may have a vague, squishy sensation about it, but I don't know. I can't describe it with any fidelity or any grace, but you're being able to articulate it, snaps it suddenly into focus. And then I take this aspect that's also very clear and obvious and effortless to me and put it into relationship with all those other things. And then suddenly we have a feel for the gestalt, the whole of the space. And each one of us as individual participants have the benefit of that upgraded resolution, that nuance, and that high fidelity map of reality that we can then use to conquer the world, take over the galaxy, the same thing we do every night, Brain. Boom. Yep.
In terms of this, let's call it like exploration towards pattern language of interactions, which I find liberating structures one of these positive projects. There are several, and also it's positive that many of these projects are not trying to, we have the solution. They don't have that attitude, but rather we're taking your structures and this is our representation. We share it with you. But one key thing and one key addition towards this exploration is kind of towards the direction you were saying, Eric, is to bring structures that we see in a more serious context, like voting, structures of organization and governance in general, on the same level. That is, you could do voting and different voting patterns just as a card. Maybe it wouldn't fit the card, or doesn't, but that doesn't really matter. It's on the same level, just an interaction pattern. And even beyond that, if somebody becomes a graphic designer in a company, that is ultimately not categorically different than the kid becomes a cop and another kid becomes a robber. It's a make-believe, but it's the matter how we treat this make-believe that makes the graphic designer a kind of consistent behavior. But the building of that moment of you become a graphic designer is really the same as you becoming cop or a robber. And that in itself is, I think, could bring this sort of medium where we're really talking of all these interactions that should interplay and mix and create hybrids between them, rather than categorizing the serious and the non-serious separately in an artificial manner.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in about, like, there are lots of these different tool sets, like Art of Hosting, and I'm trying to think of a bunch. There's a bunch of other ones of these tool sets, and the reason I just want to give more why I think this is so important is you could say that, like, our work, what we can accomplish here together today or this week is a collective intelligence function, right? And we've all had many experiences of weak and broken collective intelligence systems, right? Like, how many of you have been in companies, businesses, organizations, teams, groups, where you kind of know when you come together, you already kind of know how it's going to play out. You know who's going to be doing most of the talking, and who's, you know, like, who's going to criticize and argue about stuff and play devil's advocate, even though they may not, it may not add to it or whatever. Like, you can almost write the script before you even walk in the room, right? Having tools like this, having actually a repertoire of ways to restructure the social dynamics, is what lifts the lid on what we can create together with our collective intelligence. And so I think actually everybody kind of having some of these things, at least some in your tool belt, some that you can pull from and be able to actually explicitly shift social dynamics, actually allows us to have different outcomes than the predictable ones, which is where the fun happens.
Yeah, sorry, you will not get it back. So what I see in large organizations is the source. What I see in large organizations is the source of the problem is they try to build vertical structures, and since Babylon, we know it doesn't work out well. And they don't believe in horizontal, because then they cannot oversee the full organization. But that's a big mistake. And we knew it for thousands of years. We just need to learn from the history.
So that's maybe an interesting bridge to go to contrast these tools. So I recognize that because I've been kicked out of more environments by introducing these tools, because it did this subversive thing that included and unleashed everyone's voice, and people that had an entrenched interest with wrestling in the goat rodeo. There were expert goat rodeo wrestlers. I'll unpack that in a moment. They lost a lot of the ability to monopolize attention. So right now, we are in one of the 5 most ancient communication tools that have ever existed. These are 5 Stone Age tools. So we're in a presentation. I hold microphone, and you guys listen. Very low throughput in terms of information density. So that means that, you know, if what I have to say is of extraordinary high value, then maybe let's, but what is to be shared between you, like there's such a low probability that what I have to say actually it justifies decreasing the opportunity to throughput information at about 20 times, 20 to, I mean, how many people we got in this room right now? At least 20 times more information could be getting shared and processed versus me talking. So do I have the hubris to think that what I have to say is worth that decrease of information exchange? In this instance, it just so happens to turn out yes, but more often than not, it's a really, really bad trade, right? So if you think about a good meeting, like the great meetings that you go for and you think we're super productive, you probably have a list of agenda items, right? Topic A, topic B, topic C, topic D, but you're probably using the same 5 tools over and over again to treat those different topics, regardless of how suited the tool is. So presentation, status update. We all go around the circle, waste each other's time, telling each other information that's not necessarily relevant to everybody else in the group. The third tool being some form of managed discussion, where I'm the man with the microphone dishing questions out to. Managed discussion, at least somebody sort of in charge of the conversation and throwing the engagement around in a more dynamic fashion, but still fundamentally one speaker, lots of listeners. Some form of themed brainstorm, like throwing all the spaghetti at the wall around some topic. Super great, but not a lot sticks, right? And last but not least, the goat rodeo, an unstructured group discussion within which I, as the greatest extrovert in the room, muscle out all other participation, and you over there with that really salient and sharp piece of information that maybe is a little more introverted, maybe you can get yourself a meeting after the meeting and get a word in edgewise. So these 5 tools basically suck, and every meeting is probably using one or probably just one of all of these 5 over and over and over and over and over again, versus liberating structures, which have the opportunity to give you an explicit choice. Okay, for topic A, what's the most appropriate tool, not out of 5 Stone Age busted ass tools, but out of a toolkit of 33 explosively dynamic tools that have the opportunity to be much more appropriate to the goal of this individual agenda item, and a different tool that's much more appropriate for agenda item C. So that is a space of conscious awareness, like to make choices around that. It literally is a form of collective metacognition. So this is active participation and co-creation of the shared space of discussion, which gives us the opportunity to throughput way more information, network brains, live a super happy, awesome, good life, and have better relationships with your parents. I don't know. Anybody else?
Can you talk a little bit more about how we would integrate the information that we've developed from this metacognition? Like I sense that we've got lots of information, but it's being captured, but how do we actually like learn it and take it forward?
So how do you take the information that once you've generated it and shared it and turned it into action? So carefully, intentionally, or not, depending on how you set it up. So the basic building block of liberating structures is that, like I said, these tools are algorithmic, meaning that the output of one conversation, for example, we did appreciative interviews the other day, tell a super awesome good story to one another so that we can find the areas of overlap and consider those signal, and ignore most of the other stuff. The output of each one of these conversations can basically be used as the input to another conversation. So it is, we call that designing strings and liberating structures. So this is how you'd organize a longer conversation over, many conversations over many days, many weeks, many meetings, many months. So that that process of how do we come to action tends to be a question of coordination. So in order to come to action, it's extraordinarily important that you have a clear sense of purpose. So a tool like 9 Whys that can help you identify what's the purpose and intended outcome becomes extraordinarily valuable to make clear what you want to act towards. Different tools are much more action oriented. What, so what, now what is a good example that puts the, all right, now what do we do, front row and center. You'll notice that doesn't make it happen, right? But having the clarity about it certainly helps. 15% Solutions is a much more action oriented tool that offers the invitation of, based on the resources, time, and authority that I have at my fingertips right now, what's the first step I could take towards creating a solution? So again, none of these things, they're thinking tools, you'll notice, which thinking tends to be instrumental towards a lot of doing, but not necessarily. It's just that these bring more conscious awareness to the process of thinking and to help organize those thoughts, and that might help you do more shit. That's my bet, at least.
Sorry, in case you already said it, but I was thinking between in-person events and online activities, you can use the same kind of tools, and the website provide the info also on how to use it online, because maybe here, I think here the majority of people are in distributed teams that don't meet in person.
Yeah, so for sure, like most communication, it's way easier to do in person, but liberating structures work extraordinarily effectively in online environments. So in almost every tool, even in Discord that doesn't necessarily support breakout rooms, it's really easy to spool up a separate call for you and me to have a one-on-one, and then bring the contents of that conversation back into the shared call relatively briefly after we've done some dialogue. So yeah, for sure, they definitely track to online. That's no worries. Yeah. And yes, everything is on the website. Word. That's it. That's my time.
No.
Okay. Here? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Anna. I'm an anthropologist. I've been thinking about trust. I'm bringing together. I did a bunch of reading, and I'm gonna try to condense that and share it with you. And maybe I'll start out with how I came to thinking about trust, which was, maybe more generally, I was provoked, or you could say triggered, by the claim that Bitcoin enthusiasts make, and even Satoshi Nakamoto in the white paper, that Bitcoin would permit trustlessness, right? So we avoid intermediaries. We don't have to trust anyone else. We can just look at this ledger and see for ourselves, what is written down, which is immutable and nobody can change it, and it reflects a reality of transactions. And then I guess more recently at ETH Denver too, there was one company which was handing out these tote bags on which was written "more truth, less trust." So there's also sort of this understood relationship between sort of truth, or what is understood as some kind of stable, piece of information or whatever, and that if you have that, then you don't need trust, which I think gets at. So I was triggered by this sort of like, what kind of a social vision is this? This is weird. So I did some readings, and basically social science is full of people thinking about trust and trying to theorize it. And one of the things that's difficult about the concept is that it's one that we use as human beings in our daily life to sort of theorize even, our interactions with each other, the way that we have expectations for how others might behave towards us, or how we will behave in certain situations. And those kinds of concepts are always hard for analysts who are trying to take a zoom out from something, because it's a term that's in common use. So sometimes it's hard to disentangle or to analyze the term because we're swimming in it at the same time. So I think one thing that's helpful is there's some historians and anthropologists who sort of looked at, well, trust, where does this concept even come from? And like, have we been using it all the time? Or, you know, what is its history? And so one historian identified and looked at, you know, historical dictionaries to trace sort of a change in meaning, right? A change in the definition of trust. And she observed that it's at one point, trust was something, according to the dictionary, which you only had in God, and you did not trust other people. And that then changed, right? And at a later point, trust was something you had in, you know, other people you could, you know, share. And she identifies that it's a specifically modern in terms of modernity, right? The sort of stage in history that we are currently in. And then another observation, there are societies that don't operate in a trustful manner, right? So there's this anthropologist, Matthew Carey, who did research in Morocco in the High Atlas. And one of the things that he observed was that people did not think it was necessary that there's not a basic expectation of sort of a truthfulness in sort of everyday matters. So one of the quotes that he brings out is, you know, something that one of his informants said to him was, well, of course he lied to me. I'm his sister. So there's, you know, which, you know, strikes us as like, oh, that's not something I would ever say, right? Unless, you know, my brother's a pathological liar, but, you know, that doesn't mean that he should, you know, lie to his sister. So among these people, there's other ways of managing what is basically a fundamental, like an inherent uncertainty that we have in terms like vis-a-vis others that we encounter, right? So we can never truly actually know what is, you know, going on inside of somebody else's head or inside of them. And that's sort of a basic, you know, feature of, you know, being human, and different societies manage this uncertainty in different ways. So and this is maybe the third part of this. So we also live in a, you know, generally kind of Christian culture, and Christianity with it carries an expectation of sincerity. As you know, Christian culture expects, and this is why the Moroccan example is so maybe, you know, disturbing or something, is that we should bring into alignment what is inside of us with what we speak, right? You know, speaking your truth or things like that, or confession, or, you know, these kinds of modes. So that's sort of the historical anthropological one way of looking at trust and what it as a concept that's trying to manage uncertainty, right? Then there's another strand which I also find helpful to think with, by an economic historian whose name is Timothy Gannon, who wrote a cranky paper saying, like, why are all these, you know, economists talking about trust? We don't, you know, in economics, we don't need to talk about trust. Trust can be easily replaced with concepts like information and sanctions, right? The functioning of an economic system of trade relies on information and sanctions in order to make decisions. We don't have to, like, a creditor doesn't have to trust the debtor to pay back the debt, but makes decisions about who to give money to based on information about that person, their reliability, you know, their credit worthiness, and then also can rely on sanctions that are instituted through, you know, laws, polities, things like that, to punish or sanction individuals that don't adhere to, you know, certain contracts. Or so trust in this sort of concept is not necessary. And that brings me to, and these are clearly sort of like the middlemen, right, that Bitcoin and other advocates are trying to get rid of, so that you don't have to trust the institutions. An example I want to bring in here as a specific technology that supports trade or interaction is an old one. So I don't know if you've do you know what tamper indicating seals are, if I tell you this? Tamper indicating seals, basically all of the food that we buy at the grocery store is packaged in tamper with a tamper indicating design, right? So if you have a pot of yogurt, you have like an aluminum foil at the top, which would reveal to you if it had been, broken open or tampered with. And seals are actually like 7,000 years old, and were designed first to facilitate trade. So you would put grain in ceramic vessels that were then sealed. And so you could tell at the end of it, of course, you couldn't prevent people from breaking them and stealing them, but you could tell if somebody had messed with it or had tried to take something out. And one of the archaeologists, a book that I read about seals, said that they're devices to make honesty unnecessary. So you can tell that, the problem of, trusting other people or dealing with the fact that you can't control everyone is pretty old, like as old as writing, So seals are technologies that provide information, right, about the integrity of a thing. And then Graeber actually also writes about tally sticks and the way that those they're basically, pieces of wood on which are marked certain notches that define, a debt in a sense, and the piece of wood is then broken in half, and one is given to the debtor and one to the creditor. And at times when they meet, or when the credit or the debtor has to repay their debt, they're put together to indicate that these are the two parts that fit together. So I think there's even a market where you could then sell the debt and things like that. But that's just to say that there's also, and I think this is where it connects to blockchain technologies, is that there's affordances of these technologies that allow them to function in this way to provide information. So then the third strand is one that looks at interaction and how we interact with each other in different contexts. There were some sociologists in the 1960s who credited or theorized the way that we interact as an interaction order and as participation framework. So we all carry within us, because we are socialized to be graphic designers or whatever else we are, to know how to behave in specific situations. So this is, the lecture, for example. There's chairs lined up, and we know how to interact, right? We know what my role is right now, what your roles are, and these are ways that we can, participate together in certain generic social situations. And this even works with strangers, right? If I know that there's a bus that runs here, and if I go to the bus stop, and then hopefully the bus will come eventually, and I'll get in, and there'll be a driver, and I'll have an expectation that I'll be brought to wherever I need to go along the bus route. And so one way that Garfinkel in particular, Harold Garfinkel, was interested in how what made this order work is he made his undergraduates in a trickster spirit kind of mode conduct what he called breaching experiments. So he told students to go out into their life and to basically act in unexpected ways in very basic situations. So when they were having a conversation with their partners, to constantly ask kind of follow-up questions to the point where the partner would get annoyed, or students would go home to their parents and pretend like they were boarders at their family's house, So as you can probably imagine, those kinds of breaching the tacit assumptions of these social situations created a lot of anger and consternation. I think my favorite thing that he also did was he had people play tic-tac-toe. And this is to make very explicit. And so, you play tic-tac-toe. One person would go like this, and the person experimenting would be like this. And then he traced sort of what the different reactions were. That people would be like, oh, what are you doing? Come on, play the game. We're playing this. But then at times people would get really angry and exasperated by these sort of breaching of rules, right? So that's just to say that we are constantly operating in an unconscious way according to all of these like patterns and rules that liberating structures might also help us to disrupt. But that's to say that trust in this ethnomethodological, that's the term of this, the approach of these sociologists is that trust is an expectation of a shared reality. And maybe one example too, I don't know if you remember the beginning of COVID, but COVID for a lot of us, changed the way that we interacted, the way that we were outside, the way that we felt we could interact with other people. And probably more so, I mean, this was my experience, maybe you had this as well, forced us to sort of renegotiate and make explicit what we were comfortable with, what others were comfortable with in terms of, our own assessments of, risk or things like that. But there's, I felt like COVID is a good example of sort of disrupting the sense that we're all in one shared reality and we all share sort of the same expectations. It was sort of disrupting those. And then finally, okay, so maybe that's just to say that that even when we're trying very hard to make them explicit, that we're always still operating based on a lot of tacit assumptions about how we interact and what's appropriate and things like that. And I think that especially for governance and community building processes, this awareness is especially important to identify expectations and what is the reality that we want to share together. And the fourth point, which I've just tacked on because, is that if we look at sort of the history or the way that philosophers have thought about trust, it's often, which I think is also relevant for the online space, is based on an assumption of autonomous equals, right? Usually men who were, didn't have family obligations or were sort of had, in certain positions of power and who were newly, so this is around the Scottish Enlightenment is associated with this. We're theorizing friendships too, right? Friendships between men. And for them, they conceptualized trust as the thing that allowed this friendship to happen. And then there were some feminist philosophers later who were like, well, yeah, I mean, this is nice and good, but the only kinds of people you're theorizing in your idea of trust is, men who are in equal social positions and who had no other kinds of obligations to each other. And what about situations in a family, right? Like what about a mother and a father, husband and wife who have a child? Like what is their trust relationship? And is it not also defined by a common goal, right? To like raise a child, and also by unequal power relations. So that's, I think, an important question to also ask, like, what does trust look like when you have unequal power relations? And so the other dimension is kinship too, right? Not just within sort of a nuclear family, but within larger kinship relations where maybe trust is no longer the relevant term, but what you need to think about are sets of mutual obligations that where there's an expectation that those get fulfilled, right? Which maybe goes kind of back to the Goffman and Garfinkel concept of trust as sort of an expectation of a shared reality that can also encompass that. So this is a whirlwind, but I hope that this is sort of helpful in some way. And if you have questions, I'm happy. Yeah, please give me your feedback.
So circling back to your initial seed, the thing that stimulated you with blockchain and having like immutable information, creating a scenario of trustlessness, how has your opinion of that changed through all this reading?
I think that the blockchain in that sense actually operates as a sort of an anchor for a kind of shared reality, right, and certain expectations in a way. So I think it is in the end, it's a social tool as well that has attached to it, like a discursive community, and that people who participate in the blockchain. And I think that's something that I find interesting about it, is that it only works so long as people are participating in it, right, and contributing to it. That serves to orient them around a shared reality with specific kinds of expectations. So in that sense, you still have, I guess Vitalik has talked about is, trust the math or trust the code and things like that. And in that sense, I think that's true. It's accurate in that sense, because that then functions sort of as a technology to orient people around a shared reality, a shared project, and a shared set of norms too, that are more or less well articulated. Or some aspects of those norms are articulated and others are sort of left unarticulated.
Yeah, so what I just am thinking about is also with people having different perceptions and different standpoints on also like blockchain. There are many people out there who maybe don't understand what blockchain is actually, what it's about. And I think that people would rather trust something they know and understand, and not like with the black box effect, don't trust something they don't understand. So I just wonder, how can we make people trust a system that they don't understand? Yeah, maybe for everyone.
Does anybody want to reply to that, or?
Just actually touching base on the flow concept that Art and Eric were talking about before, like seeing trust as a process and not just an objective thing to look at, even though we have an artifact of it. Perhaps it's the experience of trust that gets people to fully understand it, rather than us trying to kind of explain it to them.
Just one note. I think also people, I would say that's partially true, but also I think people sometimes prefer the black box because they don't want to either take responsibility or acknowledge the complexity and respect the complexity. So again, this gets into Louise's research about religion.
I believe that somehow we trust science, we trust medicine, somehow we don't know, we are not sure of that. So as a coder, as a developer, I can see what Vitalik maybe thinks about when he said blockchain is trustless. Trustless because somehow you trust the code, which does always the same thing, given the same input, it always gives the same output. So the goal is to don't trust people somehow, or what they can do, because you but trust code instead, which is always acting the same way. So then still you still have to understand the code, and that's problematic because it's a black box somehow for a lot of people. So not sure if it can be possible to build a trustless community on top of blockchain, but of course it's a tool that can be.
Can I just reply, because I think this connects to what you're saying, right? And I had so clearly we live in a highly differentiated society where not everybody can do everything, and that's why we have professional communities, we have ways of institutionalizing expertise, right? We have programs where people become medical doctors, or and so we have institutions who that function to socialize people also into certain expectations, and we share those expectations, right? That in a sense, it's very difficult to say, oh, there's a lack of trust and expertise, and there's people who are questioning the epidemiologists who are modeling the way that COVID will work. But in some sense, right, there is that still as well in a highly differentiated society. Which I think still connects to the trust and as an expectation of a shared reality. kind of model. You both had.
So my question, I think it actually picks up on this. The word in your presentation that sort of triggered me or led me down a rabbit hole was uncertainty, which I think I could do, well, could have a whole presentation where you could break that down much like trust, because there isn't really a single state of uncertainty. The way you described it was sort of, we're all, we can never know what the other person is thinking or something, but actually there's a lot of gray area there. There's various states of incertitudes, of which, you can have ones that actually you can define very unproblematically and probabilistically as sort of risk. And you can know roughly what the outcome is going to be, how likely it's going to be. Then you've got things that you might describe as uncertainty, where you've got like a grayer and grayer kind of probability bar. You've got ambiguity maybe, where you might have a lot of very unusual outcomes that might come about, but you can't grade it that easily. And you've got a state of total ignorance as well, where you might just be totally surprised by something new. Why that's relevant, I guess, is it gets to this question of sort of, is the thing which you're required to have trust in a black box, or actually are there different gradations of kind of information that we can know, and can it come into greater and lesser clarity at different times? Does that then kind of condition the way we think about trust and how much it can be shared? I don't know if it's useful, but I haven't thought that much about trust, but I've thought quite a lot about risk and uncertainty, so I could provide some resources or whatever around that if that was useful.
Yeah, I would agree that it's more the latter, right? That we're constantly, I guess in a systems view, processing information that gives us, that allows us to act and to behave in certain ways, right? So if my best friend has been, a wonderful friend for, so many years, and has always acted in a way that, I feel like I can trust them, and at some point doesn't, how do I respond to that new information? And so I guess maybe what I want to add to that is that I think the danger, or the thing that I see as a fantasy of this move towards more truth, less trust, is the idea that we can externalize everything and that we can eliminate uncertainty, right? If we just have all of the information, then we can eliminate uncertainty, and that's a fantasy, right? And even through language, right? There's been tons of projects and fantasies, and math and things like that are some of them, of a perfect language that will unambiguously state what is true, get us, in a previous version, get us closer to God. Now, like, get us to some kind of truth. I think Art was first.
It's interesting to approach this from sort of an anthropological, sociological frame, because I think I'm more of a pragmatist. Like, how do we do these things in practice? And I don't limit trust to just the social frame. Like, we trust that if we drop something, it's going to fall down without understanding gravity, right? And there's some real power that comes from being able to establish things that are that reliable to build on. And so, like, when you get really far into the frame of reference that we've been sharing parts of, in terms of like currencies as language of living systems, and you start looking at the flows and the patterns and the protocols of these flows all the way down, it's like part of why we can do most of the things we can do is because we trust everything is going to keep speaking those protocols. We trust that when we drop something, it will fall. We trust, and it's like, there is a lot of uncertainty in social spaces, and yet there's also not. And we kind of don't recognize this as clearly. Like, we hurtle down the road in, rockets made of metal, trusting that the people coming the other direction are going to stay on their side of the road while we stay on our side of the road. And we are putting our lives into everybody else's hands constantly with that trust, right? And to establish that as a very reliable protocol allows us way more freedom of movement than if we were having to constantly negotiate a head-on collision without that protocol, with people that want to go a different direction we're going. And so what are those places that we can establish that same level of certainty? It doesn't mean somebody can't cross over into your lane. It doesn't mean you can just go to sleep at the wheel, right? But there's a lot that we can trust there. And so what I hear many of these attempts at sort of trustlessness is it's like, let's take some of the risk variables, the uncertain variables, and put them into more certain ones so we can have that to build on. And some of it is also kind of lies and myth, like that you've removed the trust rather than transferred it to something else. It's not trustless, it's just you've switched it from relying on an authority or a centralized organization to some algorithms that you've tried to make difficult to attack, things like that. And so the question for me that's interesting is, what ground can we create together that we can actually establish trust to build more ground, more coherence together towards the things that we want to, towards the patterns that we actually want to create, the patterns of wealth that we want to create.
I just want to respond briefly. Yeah, I would add sort of to the expectation of a shared reality, there's the phenomenological aspect to that as well, right? Which would include things like that. And then of course you can, man-made things enter into that kind of built physical reality. Pekko, and then Sean, and then I think we have to cut for the next session.
Yeah, to start off the sort of practical structures towards trust, I think there is, to build trust and to kind of expand it into some reach of social reality, you kind of actually have to develop different forms of trust. To use the Vitalik example, like trust the math, trust the code, at the point when Ethereum reaches or has already reached a certain social reality, actually the majority of the trust put onto it is not to the code or the math, but rather social reactions to its behavior. And that's the vast majority of it. But in some ways, one can look at that as a continuum, like when you're kind of building towards that and you're talking to the coder and then you're having a discussion, it's of course not just simple that the other one says trust the code, but it's mostly kind of gravitating around that. After it's being implemented, a trust context changes. And this kind of development of trust is important. It's actually, to build a social phenomenon, you kind of need this. You cannot rely on one form of trust. It's much more complicated than that. But then to bring this to your comment, uncertainty, ambiguity. So there is an angle that I spent a long time looking for a book, and I still haven't found more than one. I think there are others, but more than one good one, which comes to this point, talks to this point of actually looking at what we call religion as a much more pervasive social phenomenon. That is, yes, we believe that the thing will fall down, but also when we take a step, we believe that the flow works, which kind of points to this, that the actual frame of human operation is belief-based. It's a probability-based, probably doesn't have a number, but the vast majority of our actions are in various states of belief. So what is the relation of that to religion? Is religions really just applications towards serving this major source of operation, which is belief-based operations where we are? And the one book is Invisible Religion by Thomas Luckmann, which starts with the rant that the basic error of theology was to think that its target is religions, and then goes through a kind of sociological analysis of the only way we can really see society structures, how do we trust the doctors, as a form of similar behavior as religion. All that to say that actually it's not only that the trust is kind of complicated, it's a larger question. It is really building belief ultimately. And we cannot escape this pattern that we see in religions, but ultimately in every field we are building belief ecosystems, and that is inescapable.
Yeah, so I just want to build on that a bit and extend the medical metaphors from a background in medicine. how do we trust the medicines, the drugs that we take? Usually they have a long list of side effects, and so it really comes down to what is it better than? So what's my risk without this thing? And then an understanding of what is the likelihood of this not screwing me over and making things better, and what's the risk of it making things worse. And I think that we've just so far not really been very good at collecting the data, and there's now a lot of data about specific uses of blockchain and what problems they solve, what they allow us to get done, and what are the risks associated with that. And so we tend to base our beliefs on a lot of hype and just narratives and so on. We see hacks and hear stories. So I think that greater rigor in collecting the evidence is needed, so that the technologies can be used in past the compliance department in institutions. It's one of the things we've struggled with, and without actually having numbers, you're not going to get a self-driving car on the road.
So yeah, there's so many wormholes here. So in case, because I know people here love wormholes, a few more I guess that came up are, I think, legitimacy. And there's a really cool group, if you haven't heard of it, called Koala, COALA. It's like the Legitimacy Task Force. It's a group of mostly academics. And the first call I got on, they basically just went into what makes something legitimate for about 3 hours. And it was the most fascinating discussion I heard. So that's a really cool group. And then the other thing, it's interesting you mentioned art gravity, because we talk a lot in terms, well, at least at block science, in the engineering side of all of this, in token physics. So to kind of build in these invariants, or have kind of like a physics to the system, and that's basically what we're doing in these economies. And then the final thing you mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Raphael said about trusting the code. I'm gonna give a session about warming your hands on the governance dumpster fire later this week, to which I want to really go into this and get some feedback about your experiences, because I think a lot of this trend in the early stages was like, we can automate everything away. This gets into another wormhole, algorithm as policy, and then we cannot ever automate governance. We can automate maybe operations or certain, but there's always a meta layer, but that's actually the governance layer. It's not meta governance, it's just governance. So who's the designer and who is writing the code? We can trust the code, great. We know that input output, but what are we outputting and inputting?
There's in anthropology of religion, there's a distinction between trust in and trust that. So the famous example being the informant who says to the anthropologist, I would never trust in God. He's just a bastard who does whatever he wants. In other words, you can believe in something, but it doesn't mean you actually put your faith and trust in it.
On to the next